Hello everyone, welcome to our third video lecture for our visual methods for social science research. And for this particular video lecture, we'll be talking about designing visual research, and this will be divided into two video lectures. This part will be covering more traditional and commonly used qualitative methods or designs, and then for part two, we'll be talking about more visual method specific designs. So for this video, we'll talk about traditional qualitative methods, and we'll focus on basically the nature of these methods that are usually used in sociology and in other social sciences. And then we're also going to talk about the basic principles, and also we're going to talk about what they're usually, what their procedures usually are, what are the different methods of data collection and analysis that they usually do, and then how we can integrate visual methods. And the four traditional qualitative methods that we'll be talking about in this lecture are phenomenology, ethnography, case study, and narrative analysis. And the basis for this is the second chapter of Spencer's book on visual research methods in the social sciences. But before we delve into the particular qualitative research traditions, let's talk about qualitative research. There is a huge there's a common understanding of what qualitative research is, but there's really no direct articulation of how it can be defined. And this was problematized by Aspers and Corte in Qualitative Sociology in 2019. And they kind of, based on looking at theoretical and papers that were done related to qualitative research, particularly in sociology, they were able to forward a particular definition of what qualitative research is, and I present this in this slide. So it's an iterative process in which improved understanding to the scientific community is achieved by making new significant distinctions resulting from getting closer to the phenomenon being studied. So to further understand this idea, let's try to divide this definition into segments. And I'll start with scientific community here. And it's very important that we kind of invoke the scientific community into this definition, because for so long a time, decades ago, there is a pushback against qualitative research, interrogating whether qualitative research can be considered scientific. And there is also, until now, a dominance of positivist research, quantitative research, research based on statistics and numbers. But as we go along, in those years, trying to reclaim our space in terms of knowledge production, there's an increasing attitude, positive attitudes of scholars and sciences in relation to the contribution of qualitative research. And so I think that's the reason why Aspers and Corte kind of invoked this statement here, or this phrase here, just to say that, we can engage with the scientific community even if we don't use the traditional quantitative positivistic methods. Second, qualitative is an iterative process, and I think it's very unique to qualitative research versus quantitative research, which usually has a systematic process that follows. You go step 1, and then you go step 2, and then step 3. But in qualitative research, the boundaries between the phases and the steps are kind of blurred, and they're quite they are quite porous, meaning you can be analyzing while you are collecting the data, and your analysis can influence the next data that you will collect. So that's why iteration, or the iterative process, is very important when we talk about qualitative research. And also, for unlike quantitative research, whose goal is to predict, to determine, qualitative research aims to really just, understand social realities, rather than to say that this is what social realities is. We're really looking into how social realities make meaning to people, and how can these meanings give us more insight as relation to how we can approach this particular social construct or social reality. Um, one of the goals or one of the objectives that we see in qualitative research, although implied, is that it tries to make new significant distinctions, meaning that it doesn't aim to generalize. It aims to really describe the social reality from a very specific context. And then we kind of marry the construct being studied and the context that it's being studied. So, for example, when you talk about, you know, let's say, let's measure HIV stigma. For quantitative researchers, they have a scale, no, a questionnaire that can be numbered, and they have statements to be able to measure the highness or the lowness of that stigma. And the indicators for that stigma is external to the person answering, and also external to the researcher. Unlike for qualitative research, which you usually, explore this particular phenomenon of HIV stigma from the vantage point and experiences of those who are living with HIV stigma. And so you expect that as you study the phenomenon, you cannot really divorce it from the social context that it belongs to. What are the societal forces that shape the experiences of HIV stigma within the life history of that person? How did those life histories with the family, with school, with work, with romantic relationships, how did that shape? So you cannot divorce it from that. And while you can also kind of integrate them in quantitative research, the integration is really more presumed. And like for qualitative research, we allow some room for us to be able to see how contexts are able to shape the phenomenon. And actually, sometimes we get to revisit the phenomenon itself. There might be more to how it's defined quantitatively. So yeah, significant distinctions means that because when you invoke or when you tap into the contexts to help better understand the social reality and the phenomenon that you are studying, there's a tendency for you to be more specific, and there's a more distinct finding compared to quantitative research. It's usually linear, very numerical yung findings. And another thing about qualitative research which differentiates it with quantitative research is that you get closer to the phenomenon. Getting closer meaning the researcher is not divorced from the procedures. There's a tendency for the quantitative researcher to be involved in the analysis, and that their ideas, their own life roles will be will can affect the way data is constructed, collected and gathered and analyzed in the study. And it is based on the design whether or not you are going to 100% welcome all of the biases of the researcher, or you really have to control those biases so that you give the participants the voice. So yeah, it's getting closer to the phenomenon. Another more detailed definition of qualitative research is from Denzin in Lincoln, and it's they said that it's multi-method in focus, meaning it can invoke different methods such as interviews, looking at pre-available texts, you look at focus group discussions, and of course, as we are discussing in this paper or in this course, we're talking about visual methods, photography, filming, or looking at material culture. It involves interpretations, meaning the interpretation is coming from the researcher as the instrument, not an external standard. No, it's naturalistic, meaning you don't divorce the phenomenon from the context, as I explained earlier. This means that qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings, as I explained earlier, attempting to make sense or interpret the phenomena and not really determine or predict the phenomena or the relationships between constructs in terms of meanings people give to them. So we really look at how people draw meanings or place meanings on certain social phenomena that we are interested in. Qualitative research involves the studied use and collection of a variety of empirical materials such as case studies, personal experiences, introspections of persons and the researcher themselves, life histories, interviews, observational, historical, interactional, and visual text that describe routine and problematic moments and meanings in the individual lives. Although you will have your chance when you go to your qualitative research to be able to experience all of this. So for this course, we'll really focus more on visual methods. So to further differentiate qualitative research and quantitative research, Patton and Chisnall kind of gives us this table to differentiate. No? So qualitative research is usually inductive or inductive deductive, but for quantitative research, the reasoning is deductive. You have large arguments that you build into a hypothesis, and then you test the hypothesis using an experiment or using a data gathering procedure that is going to generate numbers, and you're going to test those hypotheses via statistics. Qualitative research is more subjective. It understands that our meanings for certain social phenomena are multiple and they are participant driven. No? So when you talk about HIV stigma, for quantitative research, it's objective, meaning that there are indicators that spell stigma based on theoretical frameworks. But for qualitative research, we give more information. We give more emphasis on the perspectives and experiences of participants. So for qualitative research, again, it really looks at distinctions, it really looks at impressions and insights. While for quantitative research, our findings are, we aim for conclusions, we aim for generalizations. But for qualitative research, we don't generalize. And then for qualitative research, we're looking at holistic and interdependent systems. So we're looking at larger, broad stroke, more broad-based constructs. But for quantitative research, we really specify, independent and what are the dependent variables. For qualitative research, we look at purposive sampling. We get key informants that are really embedded in the situation that we're studying. But for quantitative research, we like more random, probabilistic samples. Again, as I explained, for qualitative research, it only aims to gain insights, not really generalizations. But for quantitative research, what we want is to be able to generalize. For qualitative research, the aim is at understanding, getting new perspectives. But for quantitative research, it aims at, scientific acceptance. We aim at truth. We aim at replicability of the findings. Our focus is the ability to falsify the results. So those are another difference. Now, for qualitative research, we do case studies, phenomenologies, ethnographies, content and pattern analysis. But for quantitative research, when we analyze, we use statistics. For qualitative research, we focus on words, we focus on visuals, we focus on experiences, right? But for quantitative research, we focus on numbers and measurements. For qualitative research, we probe. But for quantitative research, in order for us to describe a certain phenomenon or construct, we count. So the first tradition of qualitative research that we're going to be discussing is phenomenology. And you may have heard of this when you are in your senior high school. But for background purposes, and for review, it's based on the transcendental philosophy of Husserl. And basically, phenomenology believes that understanding the inner reality of social life and knowing the underlying authentic truths of a person's experience is what is important in order for us to be able to understand what social reality is. So, meaning that when we try to understand a certain phenomenon or a construct, we have to draw upon the experiences and the life worlds of our participants instead of us trying to define it for them, and then we try to kind of see how they work around those definitions of the construct. Basically, it aims to capture the essence, and I think essentialist phenomenology is one of the branches of phenomenology, although I will not be looking at other forms of phenomenology, and we're talking about phenomenology in general. But the more descriptive phenomenology looks at the essence of a person's experiences. So maybe you've heard of studies that makes use of the phrase lived experiences, most of the time they would be phenomenological in nature. So if basically you want to understand the nature of social reality, a social phenomenon from the vantage point of the lived experiences of of people who have undergone that certain construct or phenomenon, then you would most likely be using a phenomenological research. But that's not always the case. I would argue that you have to know phenomenology a little bit more. You have to really understand the philosophies behind it in order for you to be able to do effectively phenomenology. So basically, it also looks at persons' life worlds. Life worlds meaning what are the different social systems and social experiences and different, forces that are found within the life of the person, the systems that they belong in, and how do they kind of influence the experiences. How do they influence the outcomes of the lives of people? And basically looking at unique perspectives and interpretation, one that maybe the scientific community will not be able to see with all of the tools that they use for their measurement because it's too positivistic. So according to Schutz, life worlds or Lebenswelt is the social actors' understanding of their world based on intersubjectively constructed meaning. So when we say intersubjectivity, it means that our reality is co-created with the people that we interact with every day and the different social institutions that we interact every day, and that's how we understand the world that we live in. And that's the reason why when you go from one country to the next, you expect that their expectations from other people within their nation is different compared to us. We value different things. So that is what life world is, and as a researcher, we have to look into that phenomenon based on the intersubjectivities in the life of a particular person that we are interviewing. Most of the time, phenomenological research, the main data gathering collection technique is in-depth interviews, discussions with people and participant observation, but really more on in-depth interviews. It also represents the perspective of the research participants, and in here there's kind of a strict understanding that the researcher has to be on guard whether or not they are interpreting the narratives of the respondents or the participants based on what they're really saying and what they're experiencing, and not only how the researcher interprets it. So according to Polkinghorne, there are four tenets of what makes phenomenology trustworthy. So trustworthiness in qualitative research means that this is how you know a qualitative research is good. It has rigor, and that kind of general criteria is trustworthiness with sub-criteria. And there's a general trustworthiness criteria for all types of qualitative research, but for Polkinghorne, they forward four other particular indicators. And for the first one is vividness. How vivid is your description of the experience? Accuracy. How accurate is your recounting of the experiences based on how the participants have told them? Richness. How rich is your exploration of the experience of the life world? And that's generally a qualitative thing. There has to be thick narratives, thick description for you to really be able to do a purely qualitative research. Elegance basically means that it's not really because it's beautiful or something, but does it evoke emotion? Does it improve attitudes? Does it give insight? Is it understandable? So those are the four. So we have the question now is, how do we now improve trustworthiness in phenomenology using visual methods? So this basically for the four traditions, visual methods are not required, but visual methods can be integrated for you to improve. So how can visual methods help phenomenology? One, maybe through video ethnography, capturing cultural practices using videos. It can be through photo documentation. Probably you're interviewing a person in their home and you want to and they're saying that it's important for them to, it's important that they improve the home. It's important in their home is in an important part of their life experiences. So you try to make photo documentations of their home as with consent. Researcher found images, and maybe you can also ask the participants to demonstrate their experiences using photographs. The second commonly used qualitative research tradition by qualitative researchers is ethnography. So basically, it's based on two subwords. We have ethno, which means tribe, and graphy, which means to write. And basically, we use ethnography, or ethnography comes from the discipline of anthropology, study of humans. So basically, ethnography aims to create a thick, emic description of a cultural group, a cultural practice, a cultural material, etc. In the early days of anthropology, anthropologists were more drawn into exotic cultures like tribes, cultures that are not yet, developed into modern societies, those who are farmers, those who are hunter-gatherers, those who are not yet agriculturally enabled communities, those that are distanced and they have their own rituals and practices that may not be considered rational or within the realm of scientific understanding, not modern, in general. So, and basically anthropologists try to understand those cultures and try to learn from them. But recently we're looking at everyday culture at home and looking at different social institutions, social organizations, and how they influence our lives and how do they develop culture. Because as you have learned in your earlier sociology classes, that society and culture is everywhere. It follows you. Modern societies have their own cultures. Globalized societies have their own cultures and way of life. We just take them for granted because it's the status quo. And not, when we talk about ethnography, we always talk about let's talk about tribes. Let's talk about people who aren't modern, who are hunter-gatherers, who are horticultural societies. But we can do ethnography, and there's also that movement to do ethnography in societies with other cultural forces that we may see in an everyday living. Basically, ethnography entails, immersive participant observation of the culture being studied. And for those who perform on exotic cultures, on tribal cultures, it's really immersion, staying there for a long period of time, trying to learn them ways and the functions of their ways for the individual and the rest of the cultural group. And therefore, there is that growing need. A few decades ago, there's that critique that ethnography, we try to exoticize and fetishize culture because they're nice to talk about. We try to draw them as backward. We try to draw them as unscientific or unknowledgeable just because they don't fit to the tenets of modern society. And so there is a need to be reflexive when we say that a certain researcher or qualitative researcher is reflexive, is that the researcher is aware of their social position, of their background, their individual life worlds, and how it can affect and be biased in terms of interpreting the visuals that they see, the rituals that they observe, because there is a tendency for us to other them, and instead of uplifting them, we might extend the discrimination that this minorities, indigenous minorities, or other forms of minorities may be experiencing. So there has to be a reflexivity on the part of the researcher. Like, for example, there's also always that unequal power relationship between the researcher and the researched, being the researcher having more dominance because the researcher has more access to, more dominant um, intellectual discourses. And we have to understand that ethnography, just like many of our qualitative research, is a construction. So when we describe cultures as ethnographers, we are using our instruments, our own mind, our own social realities to understand them. And again, like I said, earlier ethnographers had some tendencies to, again, view them as exotic, view them as different. And so instead of uplifting them, or engaging them in the definition of who they are, it's the researcher who utters the definitions or the descriptions of who they are. And this may, again, lead to misrepresentation or further discrimination, further othering against people who may not have been born in modern societies. So yeah, this was what I was talking about. So there's a postmodern critique of ethnography, that we don't take descriptions of ethnographers on their own. If the culture is solely described by the ethnographers, then there might be a problem with that, because again, you're viewing your culture from your own cultural lens. Maybe you've heard of ethnocentrism, xenocentrism. These things can influence the way an ethnographer views the world, and the world in front of them, the cultural group in front of them. And again, there's an asymmetry of power relations. You as an outsider, as someone who has more intellectual capital, coming to a group wherein they are generally ostracized by society because they are backward, they are immediately judged as less knowledgeable. And so there's already a palpable power relation, and there's the tendency, again, for the researcher to ascribe their power of intellect, to be able to describe the culture. So how does visual methods help address that critique of ethnography, that there's a tendency for the researchers to describe for the people instead of people describing who they are, what their culture is within among themselves? So visual methods, it helps us engage the participant and other generated visuals other than the researcher generated, to enhance the intersubjective process. Intersubjective, we've seen that before from the life worlds discussion, but this time intersubjective means that when we construct our description of the cultural reality, we engage them in defining what it is, in describing what it is, in telling us what is the function of particular cultural artifact. So for example, the researcher does not just look at a particular artifact and then watches a person use that artifact, and then that researcher already kind of knows what that artifact is for. We allow the people in that culture to further describe to us the function that in their small society. And that's very important, or maybe we can provide the cameras to the people living in that particular cultural group, and then we allow them to show us the visuals that matter to them, the visuals that are closely related to their culture, instead of you holding the camera, taking the pictures that you think is important, right, as an ethnographer, and then using that to describe them. So there has to be some form of participation in the way this is being described. The next qualitative study, and usually the common type of tradition that we use, especially for small-scale research that are done by undergrads, is case study. So case study is anything that you can study that kind of represents a social reality. For example, you want to study about HIV stigma, and then your case may be people living with HIV. You don't get all of the people living HIV, or you don't get a large sample size of people living with HIV, but you kind of demonstrate what HIV stigma is from this particular cases. And cases can be people. Cases can also be groups of people. Like you want to be able to look at, how HIV influences family dynamics, and maybe your case would be have a case for a family with high income, a family with a middle range income, and a family with a low range income, or a poorer family. So a case is a unique instance or a representative instance, an integrated and usually well-defined bounded system, and the goal of that system, whether that's a social system, a person, an organization, a thing, it has to represent, or it has to be able to demonstrate externally what no demonstrate from an internal standpoint, an intensive internal perspective of that case, the reality that you want to demonstrate. So it basically aims to uncover causal paths and mechanism through richness and detail instead of quantitative to measures, and identify causal influences and interaction. So according to Cohen, a case study delineates the nature of phenomena through detailed investigation of individual cases and their context, and how that kind of is related to the theories that you are trying to examine, or the social reality that you're trying to examine. Case studies can be strongly contextualized, and multiple data sources are used. So for example, for us to be able to fully understand a family, we interview the mother, the father, the siblings, the child. We also interview the people maybe living in that family, for us to be able to see, and then maybe get different types of data aside from interviewing. So maybe we can also take pictures of the home, take videos of the family while they're doing the thing that we are trying to study, So yeah, and that's where visual methods come in, because again, case study thrives on multiple data sources. So our goal is one type of data that can help triangulate. When you say triangulate, meaning to kind of validate the facts that you are trying to forward by getting multiple sources of data, usually 3, kaya triangulate. So maybe when you say that I am experiencing for example, there's an interview, say the family helps me in terms of dealing with my HIV, for example. That is the interview transcript of the person that you are interviewing, and that is you're trying to talk about HIV stigma in families and how it's managed within families. So that's an interview transcript. Maybe it can be validated by or corroborated by another type of data source. Like for example, you can probably have pictures of them getting together, talking to each other if they allow you, and maybe also you can get documents. So the third one would be a document, that basically tells that it is the mother or the father who pays for the HIV medications of the person, or non-HIV medications of the person, or for the hospitalization of the person in question. So that's how you triangulate, and we do this often in case studies, but sometimes they don't. But a good rigor, a case study with a good rigor would have a triangulation approach. Next common qualitative tradition is narrative analysis. So what is a narrative? So narrative, usually the first thing that you talk about when you say narrative is like the words that you see, that's a narrative. So when you say narrative, it's these are basic means of making sense of reality and working to structure and give order to events as they happen. And so when you hear Taylor Swift, for example, saying that I'm not gonna get into that narrative, I'm pulling myself from the narrative, that type of narrative, that's what narrative means. Basically a structure of how a chronology of events usually turn out. And basically when you talk about narrative sociology or social constructionism, narratives are influenced by social forces. Like for example, the narrative of your life is you getting born, living in a family, getting socialized, going to school, etc. And that's a large narrative of your life. And that narrative of your life is being reified by, reproduced by society and social forces. Now, when you talk about when you talk about the narrative of getting COVID-19 in 2020, for example, you can probably expect stories of getting discriminated, getting quarantined, having that very emotional impact on your family. So those are the course of events that happen. That's the COVID-19 2020 narrative. But now the narrative of when you get COVID-19 at this moment in time in 2023 it's not that dramatic anymore. You get tested, you don't go to school, you isolate a bit, you do it on your own, you get symptomatic treatment, etc. So yeah, so and basically that change in the narrative, in the flow of events of life, is influenced by time. It's influenced by the institutions trying to understand what COVID-19 is. And so narratives, they are kind of durable, but they aren't set in stone. They are influenced by social realities, social institutions. And that's basically what we want to study here. How from the data that we see, either that's an interview data, whether that's a data found in a speech transcript, whether that's a film, whether that's a movie, whether that's a string of photographs, what story are we seeing here? And how is that story made durable or made obvious by the social forces? And how do the outcomes of a person one in their story and person two in their story differ? What are the social forces that makes the storyline differ for them? That's what narrative talks about. So for phenomenology, we talk about understanding. For ethnography, we talk about cultural forces. For case study, it can be really any form of description actually, and any theoretical understanding. But for narrative analysis, what we're asking is, what is the story that we see here? What is the flow of events, and how do social contexts influence the turnouts of the events between people of the same or different social background? So basically that's what narrative analysis is, and that's why it's very useful in sociology, because these narratives, as I said, are influenced by, reproduced by your social forces. And it also has that idea of langue and parole by Saussure. And langue basically is the narrative that we expect, and the parole is how that narrative is played out by a certain person. So for example, there's a narrative that we expect in terms of that when you go to your 20s or 30s, you're supposed to have some romantic connection with a person. But the parole says that no, that can't be the same for everyone. Probably for a person who is queer, that expectation of getting married by 30 or 40 may not be, because again, that narrative is not supported by the social realities that we have. And so our goal again is to be able to see again the langue, the larger narrative, and also the parole, which basically is how individual people from specific backgrounds play out that narrative, and what are the forces that supports, enables, or distracts them from, or how is the narrative modified, given a person in a given social background. And then Creswell forwarded that narrative analysis can be both analysis of narratives, meaning you are analyzing the narratives as the text, or again, narrative analysis, which is again looking at large storylines, large chronology of events within stories of different people. And usually it's the second one that is more accepted for narrative analysis, because analysis of narratives can be a narrative analysis, but also it can be more discourse analysis, etc. And so again, we talk about stories. How does visuals play here? And when we construct visuals, we also construct narratives from those visuals. So for example, when you talk about films, right, and the way the films are color graded, you know that the story will be horror if it's mostly dark, right? If it's really super duper close up, and if it's multimodal, you have this type of eerie music, right? So you know that the story that you're going to expect, given the visuals that is provided to you, is a horror story. Or if it's more colorful, it's usually shot daylight at a workspace, then maybe, and then there's a woman running or something, then you kind of know, this is a rom-com trope. So that's another narrative, so that's a large meta narrative that films and visuals can be seen. Or for example, you have a collection of paintings, or a collection, parang in fashion, right? There's a collection of a designer has a collection of clothes, and they have different visuals, but they kind of tell a story because there's a coherence in there, or a set of paintings in a given set, in a given series of a given artist. So that is also there's also a narrative in that sense in that set of visuals. So within participant stories, when we do narrative analysis via interviews, we kind of see epiphanies, common epiphanies, or dramatic turning points. Like for example, usually in the stories that I did with that of when I interviewed men who have sex with other men living with HIV, they have different experiences with their families, but really kind of what changed, or what influenced their story outcomes or their life outcomes is really some epiphanies or dramatic turning points is how do families react to them coming out if they do come out, how families treat them when there are certain behaviors that kind of make them suspect that the person is gay or something. Or again, of course, another dramatic turning point is knowing that you have HIV. Another dramatic turning point would be them finally telling their parents or their family that they have HIV, and the extent to which their previous epiphanies influenced the way families react to that. So that's our goal in narrative analysis, particularly when we're studying about interview-based narratives. Narrative study tells a story of individuals unfolding a chronology of their experiences set within their personal and social and historical context, and including important themes in those experiences. So that's our goal, because when participants view their lives and when they tell the stories of their life, they don't really see it. They see it within themselves. They see it as their own experience, but they don't really see them in the grand narrative of things or in social context. And that's our goal as a researcher. When we interview, let's say 20 people, they have similar social backgrounds, like they're living with HIV. Our goal is to be able to see what are the common epiphanies, what are the common chronologies that we see. Of course, it's going to be messy. It's not going to be the same age or the same time of their lives, but you'll be able to see certain commonalities and how those commonalities differ based on social forces. So that's another way of doing narrative or explaining narrative analysis. So how can we support narrative analysis using visual methods? Life histories or oral histories can be made vivid using visuals. Like you allow them to tell the story while they show you a family album. So it can be made vivid because, again, maybe those snapshots also tell you about epiphanies in their life. Why did you take a picture in this particular moment in your life? Maybe it's an epiphany. Maybe it's a dramatic turning point. You take a pictures in their graduation. Why? Because is there a grander narrative about graduations and taking pictures of graduations? Because, again, when we take pictures of things, we deem them as important. Maybe, right? And so why was it important? Has that something to do with a dramatic turning point in that particular person's life? So really making these dramatic turning points in these stories vivid using visual methods. So some notes in using visual methods in the traditions that I just mentioned earlier. So one, it's important to improve the rigor of your qualitative method using intersubjectivity, meaning the participants must be actively involved in the research, meaning when you do interpretation and descriptions of the social phenomenon that you're studying, when you are making interpretation of the visuals that you're seeing, it's best to engage the people who you are studying in the analysis and describing what those are and making those connections in the analysis. there's a constant interplay of induction and deduction. Like, for example, there you are going to look at the grand narrative that you're seeing, that's the deduction, and then you're going to see how that grand narrative is made nuanced by the particular social backgrounds and social forces in the lives of people. So that's induction. So that's a constant interplay of induction and deduction. Like, for example, when you choose also the visuals, you have already themes and large findings, and you're just really going to deduce the visuals to put them in those particular themes that you already made. Again, doing video ethnography is important. Video ethnography meaning you're using videos to be able to understand cultural practices and cultural materials. No, again, there's that seduction of making people and events as mainly objects of fascination, as exotic, as fetishizing them. And again, going back, how do we deal with this? To not further objectify people and events, and to not objectify people who are already discriminated in society or marginalized in society, is to involve them in creating the visuals or analyzing the visuals, or basically helping them in or engaging them in describing what you need to describe or analyze in the first place. So as I explained earlier, as said by Warren, fieldwork basically is like the empirical part, you collecting the data and analyzing it, should be a two-way engagement with the subjectivity of the other, the one that you're studying, has the opportunity to assert themselves, and the political nature of otherness would be exposed and thereby open to resistance, negotiation, and redefinition. We reject the seduction to exoticize them, to fetishize them, but allow them to reclaim their stories by involving them in the analysis and data gathering procedure. Finally, Spencer bookends this chapter by saying visual sociology or anthropology entails a combination of looking critically and creatively at the mundane, at the taken for granted, developing a form of internalized dialectical approach. So dialectical is the inductive, deductive, you talking back and forth with your data, with the narratives and the visuals, to the image, along with a care for the subject, not exoticizing them or fetishizing them or objectifying them, which requires an ethical and aesthetic awareness of use of the visual form. So in this study, we talked about traditional qualitative research designs, phenomenology, ethnography, case study, and narrative analysis, and how visual methods can again improve the rigor and also make us ethical researchers by involving and allowing the participants to participate in the gathering and analysis procedure.